Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Welcome our panelists here today, who I will introduce shortly, and also listeners who are joining in on this Friday evening. We are very grateful that you'll be spending the next 90 minutes with us, talking about heat in cities. My name is Dr. Manan Bhan, and along with my colleague Ujjula here, we work at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, ATREE for short. ATREE, for those who don't know, is a globally recognized nonprofit organization. We do a lot of work on environmental conservation, as well as sustainable and socially just development issues in the country. We are also involved in the generation and dissemination of rigorous knowledge that informs and is informed by the needs of vulnerable communities, policymakers, and the wider public. We are co-organizing this webinar this evening with the Bengaluru Sustainability Forum, which is a multi-institutional initiative focused on issues of urban and peri-urban sustainability in the city of Bangalore, with an aim to foster a holistic understanding of sustainability issues as well as innovative solutions which are very city-focused. The BSF curates interdisciplinary conversations as well as collaborations involving various stakeholders in the city. The wide range of these engagements facilitated by the BSF includes retreats, workshops, panel discussions, webinars, and the works. The Climate Charche, which is this initiative that has been forwarded by the BSF and which is also part of this webinar, is a series of engagements on the interlinkages between different aspects of climate change and city systems, of which, of course, heat stress in the city is a major part. These engagements for dialogue and deliberation are being facilitated across different audience groups in the city with an aim to exchange knowledge and understand how city level plans, including, for example, heat action plans, can be strengthened to foreground adaptation, resilience, as well as climate justice. So from the BSF here, we have Mansi and Vinita who coordinate BSF activities. Ujjula and I have also been a grantee of the BSF Small Grant Program, under which we have engaged in systems research as well as outreach focused on heat stress at the ward level, which is the smallest administrative unit for a city in India. We have taken up a ward in the north of Bangalore. We have, over the last year, demonstrated the multidimensional impacts of heat stress on people who live and work in the ward, mediated by urban systems like health, like energy, like water, and the local economy. The idea of this webinar is to hear from some other experts who are also here, who have also been doing very deep and very critical work on heat stress mitigation and impact assessments across contexts in India. Through this webinar, we also want our listeners today to better understand the challenges we face going forward in tackling the climate emergency that is really upon us today. On that note, I'll just shortly introduce our panel. First up, there is Apekshita Varshney. She has founded HeatWatch with support from the Mira Fellowship, whose aim is to amplify the unequal impacts of extreme heat on marginalized populations in India and advocate for ground-up action. She's a campaigner who focuses on people-powered movements, climate finance, and accountability across Asia. She has led communications for UNDP's Business and Human Rights Program and consulted for various nonprofits on human rights and social justice projects. She has a background in journalism, and she has covered topics like the environment, urbanization, as well as gender. She holds a master's in urban development planning from University College London, supported by the Commonwealth Master Scholarship. We are very happy to have you here, Apekshita. Thank you so much for joining us. Next, there's Dr. Neeti Rao, who's a health policy and systems researcher with interest in health systems governance and intersectoral public policy at the intersection of environment and health. Her research and practice has involved providing technical support in strategic planning, policy design, implementation, as well as evaluation, including impact assessments for governments and other international development agencies. She's worked with the systems governance team at the WHO, supported research and advocacy towards a World Health Assembly resolution proposal on social participation for this year. She's currently a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in Delhi, as well as adjunct faculty at the Institute of Public Health in Bengaluru. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rao. Last but not the least, there's Sarita Fernandez, who's the co-convener of the Heatwave Action Coalition and founder of OCEAN, or Ocean for short. She's a coastal policy researcher and works on the intersection of climate with gender and land use conflicts. Her interests focus on stakeholder equity in commons, union support for small food producers, environmental defender rights, as well as creative data design tools in climate justice, environmental impact assessments, and policy audits, all to build impactful narratives. She has been a UN Ocean Conference delegate for the Youth and Innovation Forum a couple of years ago, and has been the winner of the Innovation Challenge in Sustainable Seafood. She contributes to the National Fish Workers Forum as the secretariat, the first woman secretariat to hold office since its foundation. She is an alumni of St. Xavier's College in Bombay with a master's degree in public policy. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarita. We're very glad to have you here. We'll just begin shortly, but just a couple of sort of housekeeping rules. We would be very, very happy to hear from all the listeners as well. There would be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that. I will stop at certain points and I will sort of invite questions from our listeners as well for our panelists. If you're asking a question, please indicate who that question is for, and then please go ahead and ask in the Q&A box so that I just know who to ask. I think we can begin now. Thank you so much again for joining, all of you. My first question is for you, Dr. Rao. I want to, because the webinar is on heat in cities, I really want to stress on the word heat itself and whether we really understand heat and all the dimension that it comes with. Can you just describe how, in your work, how do you interpret heat? How the stakeholders that you work with interpret heat? What kind of gaps do you think exist in really understanding heat in all its dimensions, however they affect us, indoor, outdoor, social, economic, health, etc. So over to you.
Thank you, Manan. So glad to be here. Thank you also to ATREE and also to the Bangalore Sustainability Forum. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone and their expertise. So glad to be here. And about heat, I think it's exactly right what you asked, because I mean, we sort of have grown up with this notion of, living in a hot country, and that we all, most of us anyway, have experience of heat, and we have some cultural notions of heat as well, right? And some of which we think we know how to adapt. But the minute we think about heat stress in the way that we're thinking about now, and how more recent phenomena, including climate change, of course, but also other sort of things that have happened, including the way of life, and particularly for cities, the concretization, the urbanization, what's called the urban heat island effects. All of these contribute to thinking and sort of experiencing heat, I think, in a very different way. And it's not just increase in temperatures. Neither is it sort of global warming alone in the way that we've again has become common in just common parlance, but really thinking about the mean temperatures themselves increasing because of course of climate change, and again its interactions with all of the other movements that are happening, developments that are ongoing. And also, coming from a health perspective, public health perspective, think about not only just the average temperatures going up and seemingly, each summers being hotter than the previous one, or so it seems, but also these extreme temperatures, these days where we experience, temperatures that we didn't used to before. And again, all of us, whether it's Bangalore or in Delhi or, most other Indian cities for sure, and actually even cities other than, in Europe and other countries in the region and elsewhere in the world even, are beginning to experience, days which are way hotter than we had experience of. And I think, so, I mean, these are things that we think of as something that just is, that the weather is different now. and that there isn't a whole lot that we can do other than having sort of limited adaptations on that particular day. Maybe we, fan ourselves or drink a little bit more water and so on. But actually, uh, evidence is now piling up that these lead up to something which is going to affect more or less every aspect of our life. And I think we are all, even the lay citizens, and of course, all of us who work on these issues are beginning to realize that. But I think even, the average person on the street is beginning to sort of notice this, I think, as something that adds up to a phenomena really that's impacting every aspect of their life. That then means that the policymakers at various levels, the politicians, everybody, the media, all of them then have to respond to this. Now, the ways in which they actually impact would obviously be different depending on who they are. And I think that really, can range. The diversity of experiences can be a whole bunch. So it's not just, even if it's the temperature, the same temperature might be experienced by everybody, but depending on who you are, what you do, and where you're located, your experience of it, including things like gender and your age and other, previous conditions, both socioeconomic, physiological, ecological conditions that you come with, can all impact your experience of that.
Thank you. Thanks for setting that context. I mean, Sarita, one indicator is temperature. That's one element of heat. Uh, Another one is humidity, and I would just like to understand from you, especially from the coastal communities that you work with, how are they interpreting and perceiving the change in the climate, whether that be the change in temperature as well as the change in humidity and other biophysical factors? How are they really interpreting it?
So good evening again to everyone, and thank you for having me here. So one of the first things that we actually worked on was the wet bulb temperature, and we started the coalition in 2023. And it took us a while to understand it ourselves first, like what does the wet bulb temperature even mean? Because we were understanding that in the coastal side, there is this confluence of humidity and heat coming together, especially in the hot months of April and May when you have those monsoon showers and all. With the coastal communities, I think a lot of the aspects of class and division of, what kind of jobs are done by who came into play, where they were experiencing the impacts of heat, but it was kind of business as usual for them. They were like, okay, it's hotter, but we cannot stop going to the docks, for example, with the fish workers, or we cannot stop going to the sea. Because unfortunately, in May is the last month of fishing on the West Coast. On June 1st, the fishing ban starts. So although it was very hot, and there were warnings coming from the district collector, from IMD, and we were trying to also talk to them and understand like what were the impacts they were looking at. It was more of like, oh, we are in the middle of the sea, so nothing will happen to us. And there were impacts. There was food loss, there was food as in the catch loss, fisherwomen couldn't like sell fish from summers to summers, and also there was a lot of um, purchase of ice and storage of the catch, because the ice was melting very fast. So where do they store it? So it did take a while to tell them that this is deadly heat. This is not just an extra hot summer. And they were of the idea that they don't have the privilege, or they don't have that space to even like think about it, that this is like heat that can harm them. Will it harm their business? Then they were ready to listen to us. Will it harm them? Not so much.
Are they perceiving that there's been a change over the last decade or so, or going back further?
They've been actually speaking about this way before, heat waves were even like the it word, on social media and within the civil society. They've been talking about how the migration of certain fish species that they used to catch in these seasons have just moved to another season, or has like stopped coming in entirety. One example they keep telling me of mussels and of these, Bombay ducks that used to come by May, and that whole season has now shifted towards July. And small examples, I won't get into the details of that, but these was examples they've been telling us that the sea is warming, like the water was hot, way before heat waves were a thing. So they have been documenting, and they have been informing the fisheries department, which is their nodal agency that they work with, and also trying to inform their local, authorities and representatives like the MLAs, MPs, but because it was considered a very like far off issue, and nobody knows what to do with like a hot seat. There was nothing that anybody could do about it apart from documenting it.
Yeah. Apekshita, what about the groups that you work with? On the one hand, sort of advocacy on social media, like the groups that you work with there, and on the other hand, for example, gig workers on the ground. How are they interpreting it? How are they perceiving it? What is the kind of vocabulary they use to describe heat and how it's changed over the last so many years?
Yeah, hello everyone. Really glad to be here as well. And I think in response, I will have to echo a lot of what Sarita has been saying. That I think on one level is definitely a sense of resignation because a lot of worker groups are daily wage workers. So they are dependent on everyday income for survival. So regardless of temperatures, they have to keep showing up at work. So there is a sense of resignation around that, but there's also a sense of recognition that temperatures are rising. And we hear this a lot from construction workers who we've worked with, who will describe it in ways of how quickly the cement is getting hot, or how easily they're feeling thirsty, or how much the lack of a washroom is affecting women who have developed practices of drinking less water, or drinking water but holding it in because they don't have access to washrooms. So more tangible, real world ways of talking about heat and what it's doing to their bodies and their health. And also in terms of health impacts, specifically in terms of of how fungal infections are developing, or where or what kind of pains are developing, or how easily people are feeling tired and are being unable to work the same hours that they were used to. With gig workers especially, we did a survey and we asked specifically whether it's more likely that you're working less hours given the temperatures, and majority workers said that they were working fewer hours and they were trying to take as much time off between the peak heat hours as possible. So there are various ways in which people are interpreting heat themselves, and of course there's a lot more recognition of the problem than we give workers credit for.
In the construction workers case, you mentioned that they were potentially working lesser number of hours. Was there like a knock-on effect on the income? Like were incomes being withheld because they're working lesser number of hours, or was there an understanding between the contractor and the workers in terms of sort of inability to work because of heat?
So the fewer number of hours I was mentioning for gig workers,
For
for
gig workers, sorry.
construction, yeah,
Hmm.
but yes, definitely there is a reduction in income. And because of the nature of gig work, which is not really an employer-employee relationship, it's a partner and platform relationship. So the impact on incomes is independently borne by the gig worker. So if they're making less money, it's entirely upon them. With respect to construction workers, there's a much larger policy framework at in place, because the labor secretary did give guidelines that working hours should pause between the hours of 12 and 4, but whether or not that this gets implemented is another question. So smaller construction workers who are dependent on contractors for their daily livelihood are working, have been forced to work, and that work is continuing. If the heat is absolutely unbearable, perhaps there's a pause, but work does continue as usual for construction workers.
Okay. Dr. Rao, clearly hearing all of you, I just feel like there's clearly a public health. It's not only a climate emergency that is upon us, but there's clearly a public health emergency that is upon us as well. Uh, how do you think, national health system, city health systems, and then those trickling down to a neighborhood level, how do you think, how should they respond? What should they be doing? What should we be doing? Yeah.
So actually, from what both Sarita and Apekshita just mentioned about, the populations that they work with, about how it really only becomes a big problem when they start to lose money, right? And it seems somehow that public health or individual health, even for citizens in this country, somehow isn't as big a priority And I just want to make that larger point that public health in general in India, even beyond health, hasn't received the kind of attention, both from our citizenry, but also from the policymakers as much as it needs to be. And that is partly why, I mean, it's sort of a cycle of, not having enough investment in health in general, in public health from the government, and then, you know, citizens or populations not expecting the government to actually respond to this, and for that to then again lead to this, the government's not doing enough and so on and so forth, and a cycle which is continued, I think. And that's definitely part of the problem, that despite it becoming, being so evident for so many of these populations, it hasn't necessarily translated it as strident policy action as it should have been. But I do want to say that there has been some, particularly after the 2015 news reports, really, where so many people died, upwards of, in just one city of Ahmedabad, there were like 2,000 deaths in just one summer, which were all recorded. Similarly, in other states as well, in Andhra, Telangana, and so many other states. And all of this, along with the fact that there was now beginning to be expertise globally and other sort of researchers, but also community actors who were able to get together. And there was a responsive municipal body who were then able to develop India's first heat action plan. That heat action plan primarily focused on four things. One is, how do we create an early warning system, right? We now have data, and temperature is one of those data sets which are actually been available for a long, long time, right? And it's a basic sort of climate or meteorological parameter that's been collected. So we do know what the temperatures are. And now there are some models that are available, particularly with climate change and the efforts that have gone there to actually be able to predict what those would look like. And if we have thresholds, can we already ahead of time know that it's going to become really hot? And for those durations, at least for those heat wave periods, can different populations and different government agencies as well, and employers, everybody, do something about it, or be prepared, primed to do something about it? So that's one. So the early warning systems, that was one big part. And of course, that requires already, as I said, a bunch of different actors to come together, including a lot of research to be able to use this data. The second aspect was just outreach and awareness for everybody to just know that heat is such a big problem, and that something can be done about it. The third aspect was about, even healthcare professionals really haven't encountered this degree of heat-related illnesses and heat-related impacts. People with heat strokes coming into their emergency rooms, and what we do, and sometimes it's not even diagnosed correctly because it's just relatively new. Our medical curriculums haven't had this kind of heat-related illnesses and heat stress be integrated. So for the professionals at various levels, doctors, but also nurses and everybody within the healthcare system, for them to have the capacity to be able to actually respond. And finally, the longer term things. How do we build adaptation over a period of time? So now this, starting with Ahmedabad, now actually many states, in fact, most states of the country have developed their own action plans. But as Apekshita was saying, really whether it gets implemented on the ground is a whole another issue. And one of those things is firstly, just having the political will, to say, to really make this a priority issue at the national level, but really also at the state level and at the sub-state level, even, the districts and the wards and so on and so forth. And for the local municipal bodies, particularly, who are already not, except one or two municipal corporations in this country, most of them are really facing resource crunches. And again, health hasn't necessarily been a big priority area across for all of these municipal bodies. And then to also deal with heat, which is relatively new, is an added issue. This second is just even funding. Right? Where do we get the resources, the budgets to actually do some of these things for? Then the third thing is about what needs to be done. How do we know what works, what doesn't? We have some ideas that have, largely come from experiences elsewhere or in some small pockets, the cool roofs and the green areas, or there are some cultural adaptations that people do that can maybe be scaled up. but really whether it's actually relevant for this population, let's say for a construction workers or for coastal populations, as Sarita was saying. Do they really work? That kind of research and evidence really hasn't been built up yet.
Thank you for laying out it so nicely. This was great. Apekshita, over to you, because Dr. Rao mentioned here about deaths being recorded, for example, and this is actually a very contentious topic in the sense of what really is recorded and actually more importantly what really is left out. Um, a bunch of Indian cities and also sort of rural areas underwent extensive hot spells this summer, including the city of Bangalore, for example. And there was very patchy data coming out from across the country. Uh, what are these statistics really showing? And actually, what are they really hiding? Can you just sort of talk to us about that?
Absolutely. As you said, it's an extremely contentious topic and it has to be explained in a similar way. So, just in terms of the stats, what I'll speak about are the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare figures that were presented in the Parliament. So, in the Parliament, the figures presented of heat wave, heat stroke deaths specifically for this period, for the period of March 1st to July 25th, were about 360 deaths. That was the figure that MOHFW presented. This is for the entire country. Whereas the number of heat stroke cases that were presented were about 40,000. So there's a massive discrepancy in the number of heat stroke cases that are officially counted and the number of deaths that are counted. The challenge with what a heat stroke death is, as Dr. Rao was also mentioning, is of course, lack of awareness among medical professionals as well of how to treat a heat stroke death, whether or not something is a heat stroke death. Guidelines have also come in quite recently, which is the 2024 autopsy related guidelines. And there has been reportage mentioning that doctors are talking about lack of facilities in their hospitals to be able to follow the guidelines and to be able to follow the letter and say that, yes, this is a heat stroke death. And I think an analogy that we can draw here is with COVID, where a lot of people were dying and the comorbidity was being mentioned as a heart attack or a kidney failure. But the precipitating factor was definitely COVID. And I think there's a similar analogy that one can think about here, which is whether heat is a precipitating factor. Is the person working for several hours outdoor, and is that causing the person to have a heat stroke and not get immediate intervention and die? We actually just wanted to understand what level of discrepancy there has been. And we used a proxy of media reports and reportage to understand what the number of heat stroke deaths in the country were. And we managed to look at about 17 states in India, and we looked at newspaper articles and reports on where heat stroke deaths were being reported from. And we counted 733 deaths. And this is not for the entire country. This is for a smaller portion. But again, like I said, the numbers have to be taken with a pinch of salt. I think what I really want to focus on here is the larger policy framework in place here, which is, again, what is a heat stroke death? How does it get counted? What kind of guidelines are in place? Are medical professionals and healthcare setups aware of these guidelines? Do they have the resources to be able to follow these guidelines? And I think the other part of the question is also transparency. So the central government has created a platform called IHIP, which is the Integrated Heat Information Platform, where the guidelines say that state governments should report on heat-related deaths and illnesses. But this platform is not available to the public. You can access the platform, but you can't look at any numbers. So again, it's a question of transparency. In summary, it's a question of guidelines exist, which is excellent. What is the awareness levels? What is the implementation level? And again, what is the transparency level? If temperatures are rising and if there is recognition among policymakers, as IMD has recognized that the number of heat wave days have increased, India is experiencing increasingly hot and brutal summers, people are being impacted by heat stroke deaths and illnesses. then why can't we make a system that is far more transparent and that has a lot more coordination amongst various bodies to be able to tackle this problem? I think that's the larger question.
Because reporting, I mean, because there is right now a lack of integration, and because reporting from across districts and states in the country is so inconsistent, do you think there is actually a kind of disincentive for districts to actually underreport their data for fear of being sort of highlighted? Or do you think there's like those kind of issues are also at play in terms of reporting?
I think so. There is the question of compensation as well, which comes in, because when a heat stroke death is reported, the family of the victim and the victim, of course, are eligible to compensation, which again depends on a number of factors, such as whether heat wave has been notified as a disaster in that particular state. So there are other questions at play in terms of, one, of course, might just be lack of awareness and guidelines. The other is the question of compensation and muddled policy frameworks in terms of what is being reported as a heat stroke death and what is not.
Sarita, I have two questions for you. Before I ask my own, there's actually a question from the audience. Vidhatri here is saying that, to Sarita's point regarding fisherfolk being more concerned about their businesses than their well-being, this is really indeed a significant issue. The challenge lies in crafting policy frameworks that balance economic sustainability with well-being, especially in the context of impact from heat waves. How can we ensure that both aspects are adequately addressed in a way that safeguards livelihoods while also prioritizing health and safety? So, how do you sort of balance economic concerns with well-being concerns for these kind of communities?
Thank you, Vidatri, for that question. A very good question. And these are answers already that the community or the leaders have been asking for, which is subsidies in terms of ICE, very basic things in terms of markets, being legalized. So none of the markets, for example, in Maharashtra, are legalized as fishing markets even. They are just BMC markets, which are the municipal markets. Because once you legalize it, then you can bring in like different structural changes to ensure, some support during hot days, like fans or water or shade. And they have been consistently asking for this, and we are like at the precursor of it, right? Which is why my co-convener, which is Ruhi Kumar, and I, when we started this also, we were very clear that we wanted to work on the intersections of underlying social justice issues, which are going to be amplified with climate issues like this. The fact that no markets, no licenses, hence they have no way to demand for what they're asking for, which are basic subsidies or heat shelters in already existing infrastructure is an example. So I think incentives that the government can start off with. And I will even go a little before that, just to add on to Apekshita's and Dr. Rao's points, where at least in Mumbai, in Maharashtra and Goa, and some of the other states that we worked in, but specifically with these two, there is a lot of resistance to recognizing heat as a cause of concern. Yes, as long as it's a red alert day, then yes, we will do some kind of machinery. But there is still that resistance we see within political will, within the bureaucracy, to not recognize heat as an issue. Right, and that's what permeates within unions, for example. So not just with NFF, we also work with something called the Amazon India Workers Union in Delhi. There were 4 major cities we were working in this year. It was Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Bangalore. And in Bangalore, we weren't like doing Fridays for Future India was basically taking on most of the work, which is a coalition member of HAC. And we were seeing the very same narrative that, it's hot days and we'll just put in more fans, and it's a temporary solution for a temporary problem. And this is what permeates once the government kind of does not define what a heat wave is or what heat stress is. It kind of permeates within sectors, within the corporate sector, within other sectors like the agrarian sector, for example, or the fisheries sector. So this is just to answer Vidhatri's question. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Um, to follow up on some of the aspects that you mentioned here, have you seen that there is actually people are migrating out of these kind of jobs towards other jobs, or actually migrating out of that region itself somewhere else? Is heat-induced migration something you're seeing in the communities that you work with?
Within the coastal communities, yes. So the people, the stakeholders we work with, their mean average age is, I think, 50 and above. Uh, Nobody, we find it very difficult to engage with or to even see anybody like, in the youth age group, which is from maybe 18 to 35 years. It's only out of necessity. They may be there, or they are migrants themselves, come from another state, working as laborers on these boats or in these docks. So, and even with the gig economy and Amazon workers, the same story. So we are seeing a shift from young people moving towards corporate work, moving towards work that is ensuring that there is some level of infrastructure available, a basic fan, AC, water, it's just the basics. And within the fishing community, there is a huge migration of youth from the communities towards more land-based, more office kind of, more white-collar work. From food production towards more, like commercial corporate work. If they don't have the education, they set up businesses like that to move out of the fishing sector to this, because not just the climate issue with heat, but it's also, as I said, the social issues of non-recognition of their work, non-recognition of contributions of fisherwomen, for example, who kind of set the market rate of the whole industry on, what fish is brought at what rate. So there's a lot of underlying issues, and the heat stress has just exacerbated, I can say, these underlying social justice issues. And yes, we are seeing a massive migration of young people from these communities towards other spaces and other jobs.
Yeah. My question for you was, I mean, you've been working with these communities for quite some time now. How do you, I mean, as an organizer, how do you really decide what kind of strategies to employ to really bring out the sort of insights that you have brought out till now? Which ones do you think are particularly effective? Because I feel like a bunch of us here who are listening in would be organizers and people doing advocacy themselves. How do you really understand advocacy around heat stress? How do you really understand what kind of strategies to employ to really bring out those insights?
See, it differs from each stakeholder. So since I'm talking about the coastal community, I'll speak about that. Um, it's different indicators. This is also the problem. I also want to reiterate what Dr. Rao was talking about it on healthcare professionals really understanding how to treat somebody with a heat stroke or who suffered a heat stress impact. Um, where do they go, right? So when we are devising campaign strategies, one of the first things we look at is what we have and what we really need and don't have. And most of it is devised with the stakeholder, with the communities itself. So the fact that I could say ice has been their demand every summer for having subsidies on ice for the women and for the men, it's been a very consistent demand that's come from the community itself. So that goes into our strategy formulation. But I also wish Ruhi was here to speak to you guys about narratives. But it is also based on the narrative we are trying to set. So within the campaigns, we have a narrative that we want to build. For example, a narrative being healed. This heat is deadly. There's something called a heat wave, and it can impact you and your livelihood. Right? This is a narrative. But how do we back this narrative up to the government or to the stakeholder itself? As I said, most of the communities, when we spoke to them to document heat stress, they were like, it's fine, like just, our 2, 3 key demands on ice and diesel and markets, but we don't need anything. We don't need any medical assistance or something. Just get us these basics, right? So then how do we build that narrative when your community itself kind of does not want to agree that this could be an issue for them? And that's where we use relevant data. So we've used the Ahmedabad data before we use the data in Chennai, because we can't use Delhi-based data or, non-coastal states-based data to them, because they will just be like, this data is not relevant to us, it won't happen to us. And we are better than like a landlocked place because we have the sea, right? So there's a lot of cultural things that come out, again, Dr. Rao was saying a lot of cultural solutions are, oh, we are like of the sea, so we are strong and nothing's going to happen to us. And it's also very patriarchal is what we've seen, that it's mostly the men who talk on behalf of the communities. The women are mostly not in these leadership positions within unions or even organizations. They are not boat owners. So they are not calling the shots within the sector itself. So they are like, no, this we are used to it. And, we are by the sea and everything. But when we are trying to back this narrative up, we have to find consistent data. And what Apekshita was saying, just 300 to 400 deaths recorded for the whole country of a population size of us is pretty impossible, like to grasp. Like I can't possibly believe, like that this could be the number of heat related deaths given the number of hot days and the impacts it had. And also, who's collecting the data? When we were looking at states, we only found data from Odisha, some data from Andhra, some data from Tamil Nadu. And we couldn't find where is the other data. Like even with RTI or with any other tools that we have, if the governments have not collected heat related data, there is no data to like even look at. So, I'm just trying to go back to these different processes to a starting point where the basics of what we need in this baking of this cake are not there. We don't have anything together, but we need the cake. It's something like that.
Apekshita, there's a couple of questions for you from the audience, from people listening in. With the growing impact of heat stress that we see, so many deaths, for example, why do you really think heat waves are not being notified as a disaster at the national level to bring them at par with floods and other disasters?
That's a great question. It's really a question we've all been wondering about. There are speculations that exist at best. This decision was made according to the Finance Commission's report a while ago, and the questions were raised in Parliament this August, where the government reiterated that there are no plans to notify heat wave as a disaster. But what has happened is that states are notifying heat waves as disasters. So just this week, Madhya Pradesh notified heat waves as a disaster. Why is the notification not happening centrally? We can speculate one reason could be funding, because when a disaster is notified nationally, there is the National Disaster Resource Fund, which comes into action, which states can appeal for and get funding from, which currently is applicable for a variety of disasters which states face. The other is, of course, the question of compensation for families themselves, which is interlinked with the question of funding. Uh, I think partially it's also the sort of the cultural rootedness in us that we are a hot country, and this is something that we are going to deal with at all times. Because extreme heat, as we are now talking about, has been a very recent acknowledgement, even in the policy circles. The heat action plans, even with Ahmedabad, are very new. The other challenge also is that heat is not as optical as, say, flooding is or earthquakes are. We Heat really has a slow effect over a very long-term period. It has effects on people's health. And also, another reason is who is really being impacted mostly by heat. It's marginalized outdoor workers. Your caste, your gender play a huge role in the impact heat has on you. So, and people who are mostly impacted by heat are also people who are very absent from policy circles. They are people who don't have a voice, who don't have the ears of policymakers to be able to petition to them and to say that these are the challenges that we're facing. So really, it's a combination of multiple factors where social justice really comes at the core of it. That who is being impacted by heat, how badly are they being impacted by heat, and are their problems really being given the attention that they deserve? I think all of this play a role into the way we're responding to this crisis at the moment.
The corollary, the sort of flip side to that is that, let's say the state of Madhya Pradesh, like you said, has declared as a disaster. What does that really mean? for that state and for the people of that state? Can you just briefly explain so that I think it will be useful for our listeners?
Absolutely. I think I want to say this with the by firstly acknowledging that there are policy frameworks are muddled. We lack clarity on what exactly this means and what the response to the notification of disaster is. It will only come to uh, the surface as time goes by. But for other states where the notification has existed, there is a framework and there's an administrative setup with heat officers, with heat stroke units in hospitals, with compensation plans, with heat action plans being in existence, with more awareness in the administrative setups, with early warning systems being in place. So at the policy level, especially, there are steps that are being taken to set up a few things. Whether they penetrate to the ground level and whether implementation takes place is a second question, is another question. But it really becomes like the first step. The notification of disaster really, as many academics and NGOs practitioners have mentioned, it really becomes the first step in the recognition that heat as a disaster is here to stay, and we really need to be acting upon this disaster preemptively as opposed to reacting to it as we are currently doing. And everything else that follows, which includes, smaller aspects such as maybe compensation for people who are most affected, regulation of working hours, better healthcare systems, all of that does not fall under the purview of the notification of disaster. So for all of that, work has to continue. But this becomes like the first step and an entry point for us to champion for and ask for better services and better conditions.
Uh, Neeti, if I may, over to you. There's one question from our panel. It's actually something very, very interesting here. Is that what ongoing research on interventions that adapt to extreme heat are you really watching out for? What's the sort of state of the art research on heat stress happening? What are the sort of things that they're focusing on? What are the major research gaps coming up? If you could just sort of briefly talk about those.
I actually also wanted to come in on the issue of notification of disasters because I actually asked the NDMA person in charge why that hasn't happened at the national level. And it's interesting that he said the number of deaths haven't met the threshold for a national notification. So the kind of work that HeatWatch is doing is actually extremely invaluable in terms of just counting the number of deaths. But as Apekshita was saying, many states are beginning to do, and what that primarily means is that now there is a dedicated budget line to actually act on it. So the Disaster Management Authority now have a mandate and an administrative sort of go ahead, so to speak, to be able to do these things, and they don't have to rely on sort of squirreling little funding sources to be able to act on, all of the heat related activities. On the kind of research, I think there's actually there's a huge research gaps, frankly, and there's a need for all kinds of work at various different levels. For me also, maybe this is my bias coming in as a sort of qualitative researcher, in that I don't think there's as much of a, it doesn't really matter what the exact number of people who died of heat stroke or heat waves are in some ways, because we know that the number is big already. But it's more about the kind of thing that, Sarita was saying about sort of situating all of these various impacts. So it's not just, the health impacts or the economic impacts, and for them to be disaggregated and for us to be able to say, oh, this amount of GDP is going to be lost, or these many number of deaths, or whatever those statistics are. Frankly, that research is also important, but really also the kind of research that sort of situates this whole, all of these different kinds of impacts of heat together on all aspects and from different kinds of regions. That's another thread of research, I think, that's actually very valuable for advocacy and to be able to mainstream the issue. The third thing is also just the basic climatology kind of research. We know already just from experiential input, but also some other, smaller studies, including, one that I was involved in, that of course, dry heat is important, but also humidity is important. And the kind of heat impacts potentially that exists in places like, let's say, Ahmedabad or Delhi is maybe very different to what's true for Odisha or many of the coastal regions. or even within a place like Delhi, like what the October heat that we're going through now is quite different to the kind of, June, July heat, dry heat that we were experiencing. And each of them actually have different kinds of health impacts. And it's not just the number of deaths that immediately happen during a heat wave that we need to measure, but also the follow on, the knock on effects on morbidity. How many people then who may have been able to manage, for example, their diabetes reasonably well, are now much more susceptible? How many elderly populations become much more vulnerable to, you know, secondary effects, including, of course, death, but a whole range of other kinds of, other kinds of health impacts. That's another, big stream of research I think that there is a need for. There's also need to understand how multiple climate, or multiple environmental actually determinants of health interact with each other. So, for example, air pollution and heat are, interact quite significantly, and we don't really understand. And again, so many of our cities in India here are, rank among the top 50 most polluted cities. And we don't fully understand what the relevant pollutants are, at what time scales, and so on and so forth. Finally, what I was saying before, there are some solutions. So there are these green roofs, cool roofs that have been existed, and it's considered a relatively cost-effective, low-cost solutions that are really applicable in many places. There are the green walls, there are, blue and green infrastructure, which maybe depending on the areas that you are in can be developed. There are also some, other kinds of solutions, including building techniques that can be used, and there's research going on that. There's also research from other countries about, heat at what height even. So the land surface temperature, that is what we are able to record. But really, for a health impact, maybe it actually affects differently depending on whether you're a tall person or a child, for example, and how that might impact how much vegetation there is. So all those kinds of biophysical kind of research, that's another thread. And the things that are most relevant to policymakers. How much is it going to really cost me in terms of money, but also in terms of, the number of people who have to engage in this? What kinds of, data systems do I need to build in? Can I have a digital solution to deal with some of these things, and whether that's cost effective or not? So implementation research, economic research, all of the policy relevant research that's needed. That's again a huge, there's some of it that's beginning to come up, but there's a huge need and a gap for it. And I just want to say one last thing on the research question is that, we think of research as something that happens in the labs, or we have these solutions that potentially can then be brought in, and we can have similar solutions, to across the country. We can scale it up, as they say. But heat, and perhaps also some of the other climate related conditions, are going to need decentralized solutions. So it's not going to be that there is, we have one research that shows this X solution really works well, and we try it out in, let's say, Bangalore, and then we say, oh, let's now scale it up to all districts in Karnataka, even. Forget the country. Even Karnataka may not be the most appropriate way to do it. So we're going to actually need to build these research ecosystems around the local areas and the local implementation groups, multi-stakeholder implementation groups, who are responsible for actually implementing these heat action plans at local levels. And that's somewhat of a new paradigm. And it's something, as Apekshita was saying, really, the policy ecosystem is not very well geared up to deal with something like this. And this is where, communities like this, even these kinds of webinars, are actually going to sort of advocate more and more and work towards building those ecosystems, just getting all of these people together at local scales. I think that's going to be super important.
I just wanted to follow up on a couple of points that you mentioned. One of them was the one that you mentioned last. So with the need for decentralization would come the need for capacity building down to the ground. I mean, down to the ward level, down to the neighborhood level. How do you think that would sort of occur? How do you think that would happen? How do you think that would be implemented?
So, this is a common, it's the sort of question that you get from the bureaucrats. And I really feel that there's a lot of local knowledge already. People already know what's going on with them. And a big part of the research really needs to be about highlighting what the local lived realities are. That's, I think, the starting point. Beyond that, in terms of the specific capacities, I think there are now quite a bit of, researchers who can be deployed to be able to address them. I don't think it's necessarily so the capacity building is more about getting the policy stakeholders to be actually allow room for all of these different people to be able to input them in ways and then to be able to take the translate this experiential input and then combine it with the scientific evidence to be able to do something policy relevant with it. I think both things exist. Where capacity building needs to happen is in being able to put it together and be able to extract something that's policy relevant.
The other thing that you mentioned in the middle was about the intersection of heat with other hazards that are existing in cities in India at the moment, air pollution being, for example, one of them. So that really brings out the fact that heat stress is a threat per se, and heat stress is also a threat multiplier. It can multiply the issues that other hazards bring up as well. Keeping that in mind, and you mentioned earlier about heat action plans and the Ahmedabad being a successful example of that, for example, at least designing the plan itself. Do you think currently our heat adaptation plans or policies appreciate this sort of linkages between different disasters or not? Or how can they sort of quickly sort of try to start appreciating these issues of heat being a threat itself and heat being a threat multiplier as well?
So I think there's research now, and there's beginning to be evidence that shows that there is this interaction. Now, the exact nature of it, we still don't know. And that's where the research gap comes in, right? We don't know exactly what pollutants exist that and how they, what in terms of the degree change or perhaps the time of the year and seasonality and all of that, those kinds of details we don't yet have. The kinds of details that we would need in order to do something about it, frankly. We don't yet have that. And that would then be the next level. But again, and this is partly why I was saying that we need to address things like heat within not just as a health issue or a livelihood issue or as a separate or a climate issue in these kinds of sectoral silos that we're used to dealing with these kinds of problems before, but actually situate this within the lived reality of the population. So make it much more population centric and link it up with social justice really, but also with local policy ecosystems. So we do want to talk about all of the ways in which it affects these particular communities. How does it affect women? How does it affect the gig workers? How does it affect the construction workers? And in the context of everything else that are going on. So many of these construction workers, for example, are already migrants. So what resources do they have? So even if you tell them that you're going to have there's going to be a severe heat event, but how much agency do they have? What kinds of resources do they have at their disposal to be able to act on it? Who are the relevant policymakers even? Is it if most of these construction workers end up going to the private sector, to the local clinic, who they know, who's maybe from their community, who's maybe the only one even who they're able to go, who's maybe not even a formal health professional, trained professional. Within that reality, in that complex reality of their social, economic, health seeking behavior, but also all of the other things that encompass, what kinds of homes are they living in? Are they living in a tin roof shed, where maybe heat inside the house is that the indoor heat is probably a bigger problem than for them to be outside in the construction site, potentially. Maybe they have more resources at the construction site, whatever minimal, maybe they have like a water supply, maybe there is a washroom, which maybe they don't have at home. So if you have a guideline that says, work hours should be, people should not be working during the hottest hours and they should stay indoors, like we saw during COVID, right? Those are not things that are going to be relevant or actually meaningful for some populations. So we need to think again. I mean, it's great to have these heat action plans, but to really start with them as frameworks and then to say, okay, what's going to be most relevant for these communities? And I think there was a question or maybe a comment from one of the audience members about case studies. I think I really do believe that we need many more case studies, but not for them to be small, case studies from here and there and disjointed ones, but for all of them to come together in ways that actually say, okay, so this is how diverse these situations are, and we have these heat action plans, and we have these multi-stakeholder committees. How can we set it up in a way that's actually responsive to the lived reality of these people that we're catering to? And that's a whole different way of policy making, I think, than what we're used to,
Ab-
unfortunately.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, it's sort of there's enough work out there which says that a lot of these heat action plans are at the moment maybe not fit for purpose, still sort of have significant gaps, not only in their designing, but definitely their implementation as well. Related to that, there's a question of Apekshita for you, but actually I would like to ask it both to Apekshita, you as well as Sarita. Uh, Now that we know that heat action plans are there, but they are sort of still the implementation is, I would say, variable at best. How do you really envision community-driven cooling solutions? If policy frameworks like heat action plans are difficult to be implemented on the ground at the moment, what are the challenges that exist for communities to sort of take matters in their own hands, basically, to collaborate with NGOs so that they can provide for themselves cost-effective, maybe even tech-driven solutions? So have you seen some examples of them sort of being the case? What are the challenges existing, or basically action to be taken up by communities themselves?
Should I go first, or Sarita, would you like to?
Yeah, go for it, Apeksha.
Okay. Sure, I think that's a great question and something that we need to think and talk about a lot more, especially when it comes to community not just building infrastructure for themselves, but also being able to access it. So, one big challenge with top down approaches when it comes to what is mentioned in the heat action plans, as well as otherwise, is there's a lot of talking at communities in terms of, oh, we'll build a cooling center in the middle of this market, without really thinking about the lived realities in that particular milieu, which is where uh, female street vendors would tell us that if there's a cooling center and the men are sitting inside, we will not be able to access it. So we will end up staying outside. So there are a lot of these smaller practices which we have to keep in mind, which can be immediately avoided if the community is at the forefront of designing these solutions. And one major thing that has come up, say from the gig workers, is improvement in urban infrastructure and access to that urban infrastructure. One very small example is that of green spaces and parks. Whatever remaining green spaces and parks we have in various parts of the country, many of them tend to be shut off between the hours of 12 and 6, or even more. Despite that being the hours when people who need rest and shelter most need a space like that. So how about keeping that space open? How about communities having ownership of the green spaces around them and actually being able to access them without really without elitist and casteist ways of approaching what a community space is? I think that is one thing. The other thing also is in informal settlements where the threat of eviction is often hanging upon people who are living in informal settlements, where heat is a killer. And as Dr. Rao was saying, um, working, of course, like people are working in terribly bad conditions, but people are also living in terribly bad conditions. So tin roofs, tarpaulin roofs are just trapping heat inside and creating further urban heat island effects within low income settlements. And there is a question about heat island effects in from the audience, and I would just like to highlight that within the idea of heat island effects, low income settlements repeatedly show much higher temperature thresholds. A study by WRI in the month of October in Mumbai has found that low income settlements are 6 degrees hotter than a relatively formal building, green neighborhood apartment. So here the question comes to, can we provide no eviction guarantees? Can we let people build their own homes? Can we provide funding and smaller grants to people to be able to build with sustainable materials? I think these are the kind of solutions we need to be thinking about. We need to stop making cities for cars and flyovers and think about cities from a very bottom up approach of what people actually use, what kind of spaces people actually need, and who is really being able to access it. And once we start asking these questions, automatically community driven solutions will come at the forefront of whether it's greening spaces, whether it's access to water, it's access to rest, shade, access to washrooms. All of these things then become a priority and then get implemented.
Yeah, just to Apekshita, I think covered most of the points, but just to reiterate that communities are very good organizers, specifically small food producers, whether it's fishers or small farmers or even pastorals. I'll give this with an example on the pastorals called Van Gujjars in Uttarakhand. So very close to Dehradun and in and around the forest of Rajaji Sanctuary. And they basically have these seasons where during the winter months they migrate. They take their whole cattle, their whole village, and go to another part of the forest, which is warmer. And during the winter, they migrate. During the summer, they migrate to a colder, more higher altitude because they have sheep and goats and other cattle, buffaloes being their main cattle. This year, one of the wife of the Van Gujjar's leader told me that it was the summer has not got over. And this was in August, and she said that it's usually we didn't even come to know when the summer would come in these parts, right? And migration became more like of a cultural thing also for them because there were other communities wherever they would migrate. And now it's becoming a cause of necessity more that how do they deal because their houses are made of cow dung and most of them don't have Forest Rights Act, so they don't have any land ownership or they have no place to be apart in the middle of a forest. There's also a lot of inclusion of wild animals coming closer to water bodies because they are in search of water, so there's increasing conflict. So my point is that communities know how to organize themselves. They already document what's happening. The part where, and I'm sorry if this comes off as like a demotivating or discouraging factor, but the part of class and caste really plays into how they communicate heat stress to authorities or to even NGOs and civil society. Most of the pastorals like nature dependent communities and small food producers don't think that they have the privilege to report heat stress as an issue towards them because they already don't own land, they don't own any kind of infrastructure assets, or even it's not even community owned in fact. So it's within the middle class and the very urban the non like even in an urban space, the fishing community is like a community apart from the city, right? It's always like the fish market is there, the koliwadas are there, and then this is the city. So that really comes into how they report and how they even share these impacts, which is why when we asked them like, was the summer hot? They were like, yeah, it was hot. The summer never got over. But there's nothing more than that. And so what we have seen as a solution, because we cannot go with like, oh, okay, we can't report this, and we don't feel we have the privilege to tell authorities that this is happening. We've started speaking to the women. So we've started looking at the intersection of heat and gender a lot when we are trying to work with sectors, where we're trying to document what happens to the women, what's going on with their menstruation days during hot days, what's going on with outdoor work when they have to do this. And with that, we are getting some amount of data. But again, like it's very difficult for communities to organize by themselves when we have a very big issue of caste and class being a very big hindrance to even report heat as a stress. On the flip side, in more organized spaces like the Amazon Union warehouse workers in Haryana and Manesar, they already know how unions work. They formed a union and they spoke to the Haryana government and the Labour Ministry that they needed a good cooling system, they needed breaks, and they needed space to rest. So if people who are not aware of this issue, so Amazon India has a warehouse in Manesar And people are timed, like they have some kind of a watch or something on their body, and they're timed to each second, and they have to finish an order that they pack and send at different levels of the process within the stipulated time, like that's 2 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. And because they were low, because it was a hot summer, they were low on sales, or their delivery times or whatever, they asked employees to not take washroom breaks or any of their rest breaks. And in fact, they closed the rest areas and washroom where their IDs also couldn't open these doors. So they basically mobilized and they formed a union and they wrote, and that's when. But because it was a city, because they had access to people in the Haryana government, they had access to civil society like us and other groups that were present there, they could do this. But you go away from a very organized corporate union space to more of an informal space, like Van Gujjars of Uttarakhand, or small scale fishers of Mumbai, Goa, Karnataka. It's very difficult to like tell them, oh, let's come and document, let's go and campaign for heat stress. They are just like, that's not the issue. We want like land, we want the basics that we've still been asking. So yeah. Manan, you're muted.
Sorry. Just related to that, because because of the lack of social capital that they have, and it is, uh, these are communities that we work with. How do we really bring out their stories not only effectively but also respectfully? Like, what are the sort of things that you do or things that you keep in mind so that you appreciate the complexity of their stories, you appreciate the different aspects they're bringing in, and documenting them very, very respectfully? Like, how do you sort of ensure that? Can you just talk us through that? Sarita, over to you.
Sorry, I missed you a
I can
bit.
go again. I can
Yeah.
go again.
Sorry, yeah. Checking
No
what's wrong
problem.
with my internet.
I was saying that because of, like, just related to the point that you made, there's a lack of social capital that these communities often have. How do we as activists, researchers, organizers ensure that their stories are documented not only effectively, but also very, very respectfully?
See, this is also not just for heat, but for any other. It's
Yeah.
just like a nice best practice. Whenever anybody from the civil society goes to them, even if it's not civil society, it's academia, like a student goes and is doing a project on heat waves and wants to document a community. They always, have this notion that, okay, you're going to do your thing, and then we don't know what you do with the research. So I think one of the best ways to do is to come back and show them what was the report you made, or what was that tiny social media post you made, or the documentary you made, because then they have this kind of assets, I will call them, to go and use it in their campaigns. Right. So a lot of the reports that most of us have made during heat waves and stress, if we are documenting a particular type of community, it would be a really nice practice to give that final report, like to make it an end-to-end project. And after your project, or after the funding does not get renewed, to give whatever we documented to them, which can be useful for them in their present or future work also. So I think that as in terms of a social capital and in terms of what we can do as a best practice for communities could be one suggestion.
Apekshita, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Sarita. I think there is quite a bit that we need to do as people. One, of course, the question of, I'll tackle the first part that you said in terms of how do we respectfully document and narrate these stories. And I think one is we need to first challenge our own notions about a lot of outdoor work ourselves. And this has been a learning for me in conversations with a variety of researchers and practitioners, where there is a tendency to question people's practices without understanding their lived experiences. So ideas of, but why don't they drink more water? Or why don't they take more shelter when when there are possibilities? Or why isn't there or why don't they try to change professions? So ranging from the absurd to very disrespectful ways of understanding people's work. I think that first we need to challenge and question our own inherent assumptions and biases about people's work. I think that's very, very important. The other thing, and I see a question from an audience member where they are recognizing their privilege and asking what can we do when it is about adaptation to heat. Think about your own domestic workers. Think about the guards who are in your society. Think about people who are working around you and who are working informally in very poor conditions. What are you as an employer doing for them? You may not be the only employer. It may be a society, it may be a complex of multiple secretaries and multiple people. But are you providing a living wage? Are you trying to ensure that their hours are regulated, that they're not exposed to extreme heat within your own premises? I think that's a very big start. We're surrounded by informal work in India is not a far off notion where none of us is engaged or it doesn't affect any of our lives. It affects all of our lives. Most privileged elite people in India employ informal workers. Start by improving working conditions and pay conditions for the people who work with you and for you. And that I think will be a very big step forward. Because as we've been saying continuously, heat or any form of disaster is not just a disaster of that particular time. It's an interlinked issue with housing, with wages, with rights, with your identity. And I think it's important to bring those questions into consideration. Making ourselves uncomfortable is really the first step to being able to think critically about this and to be able to do anything to solve this.
Thanks for answering that really well, really nicely. Neeti, there's two questions that I will bunch up together for you, and I might ask you to respond to them. There's one question here about the efficacy of nature-based solutions and how that can be incentivized, like green roofs, for example, blue-green infrastructure. There's a bunch of projects that I've also seen, all of them on a pilot level in the city of Bangalore as well, without sort of, I see scaling happening anytime soon, and with very sort of inconsistent efficacy as well. And then there's another question about how can the insurance landscape deal with increasing heat waves? Would you want to sort of say a few words about both the nature-based solutions part? How can that be incentivized? And how would the insurance ecosystem deal with these sort of challenges going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, both of these things, to my mind, are not necessarily the kind of most marginalized, or we can't possibly expect somebody who's living in a slum or in a construction site or in the middle of the forest even to then say, oh, now you build infrastructure, additional infrastructure, whether it is nature-based or not, for yourself to be able to manage. I mean, that's an additional burden that you're putting on individuals. And some of these solutions are actually more for the for the likes of us, I guess, who have the agency and the ability, for builders and for rules, for norms to be set up. Let's say all government buildings, for example, or all buildings that, corporate buildings shouldn't or should have less, uh, let's say, glass, and should have green roofs, should adhere to the existing building norms. There are now green, building norms and standards that are mandatory in some places. Implementation of all of those kinds of things, and absolutely some of these solutions are things that let's say somebody who lives in an apartment but can potentially do some small things, including greening. Somebody, a builder or a big company owner who has the resources within their office, within their buildings, to be able to install a green roof or a green wall. And the green and blue infrastructure is really for the planners and for the people who would make decisions on land use patterns. And these are, likely to be solutions at somewhat larger scales. And those are very important too. And I want to say one other thing about it is, so far, I was the one who was saying we need decentralized solutions and we need to think about the lived reality of different people. But I do think that there are these sort of large scale solutions that are also equally important, some more top-down things, right? And even things that actually affect people like us, people who are much more privileged, who have much more of a voice in the policy ecosystem. And it's important that those issues also get flagged. Apart from what Apekshita was saying about, our own, the people that we employ, the informal workers that we employ. And some of those things, so for example, in this summer in Delhi, we had these big air conditioners catching on fire spontaneously because it was just so hot. were so many buildings where people said the ACs are not working anymore because, the thresholds of heat have actually gone so high. So of course it's a problem. And of course, those who are already deprived, already marginalized, already vulnerable are going to have the most immediate effects. And they're also going to have the lowest capacities to be able to deal with it. But even the kinds of impacts that relatively better off people are having. So that, links back very quickly to what is the design of a building? Are the building norms, the building standards that are there, that are they being implemented? Or do they take into consideration the kinds of, heat stress, for example, that's coming up? Are they fit for purpose in that? All the existing policies, are we protecting the trees that we already have, the parks that we already have, the lakes that we already have? What are our governments doing in order to sort of preserve and to be mindful when building, let's say, a big project, big infrastructure project, let's say, or whatever that might be, larger sized ones? Is there an environmental impact assessment that actually takes into account heat within that? So now these are all existing policies, actually. It's not that we need a new sort of, heat action plan or new resources and new advocacy to get some new policy in place. These are all existing policies, but can we have greater accountability? So some of that advocacy and the attention, both from, just the average citizens, but also stakeholder groups like the CII and the organized unions, the employers associations, the apartment residents association, all of these kinds of organized groups can actually advocate for some of these existing policies that are very much tied to how green, sustainable, environmentally, resilient our communities can be. And those actually have effects. I mean, if you have a park that's well preserved and green and well maintained in the locality, that's helpful to, the fancy car owners and the people who live in the community, big houses in the area. But it's also useful for the maids and the helpers and the informal workers and maybe, people who have nowhere else to go. Maybe it's more useful even for them. But it also improves, let's say, the real estate prices in the area. So it's a win. So there are these win-wins that can potentially work across our class and caste kind of division. So there are some of them that also are equally important. Sorry, I might have just distracted myself into I don't know if I answered all your questions.
No, I think you did. Just Sarita and Apekshita, just final remarks from you. You mentioned a bunch of things that could be potentially done. And I remember, Sarita, you saying at the beginning about markets, like markets being legally sort of called as fishing markets, for example. Apekshita mentioned park timings, for example. These are fairly, I mean, to any one of us, these are fairly low-hanging, fairly easy implementable solutions. Why are they not being implemented? Like none of this sounds rocket science, lots of sort of planning, etc., to sort of come into action. What's stopping them?
That's going to be another webinar on land use conflict. Largely it's land use distribution. Who gets these are infrastructure and community used infrastructure like markets or parks, public spaces, commons, as different words for it. And obviously, it's been like a constant tussle with the government wanting more flexibility, in different states, center states, everything. It's a common pattern of, they wanting to own the land and basically call the shots of what happens to these commons. And it's the same thing with markets where the Kolaba market, the Sasun docks, which is one of the richest docks in Maharashtra, right, is also like prime real estate. It's one of the most expensive places like across the whole state. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so community owned and it's such a big coastal commons there within the stakeholders that the government does feel the need to have more this thing. And it's also larger conflicting stakeholder, other issues like say the port industries or, the security agencies want more land to like expand. So these are other issues. But just for the closing remarks, I wanted to tell you all a few statistics that I love data and stats. So I've been reading up on the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, for a project, and I was just seeing the budget this year that is given. It's a climate budget that the Maharashtra government has given. So the BMC, which is the Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation, is one of the richest municipalities in the world. Last year, they docked 59,000 crores in 2013, 2023, 2024. So they have reserved 10,000 crores as their climate budget, which is, very minuscule amount from what they've earned. And from that, only 0.2% is going for something called urban greening and let me just read urban greening and biodiversity. It's 0.5, sorry. And 36% is just going for urban flooding, because flooding is a very political issue. It's you can see it, you can feel it. People make reels out of it. You can call it out. And such a big city, whatever they call it, financial capital, going into floods each and every year, like it's becoming a problem. So 36%, which is about 9,700 crores, is just going for urban flooding, and just 0.5% is going for something called urban greening and biodiversity, under which they are speaking about urban heat island effect. Now, this is just an example on how when there is no data with the government on what they are supposed to do with heat, right? Or what they can spend that money on. That's the starting point of where we are all at. That's what we are talking about, I think. Where could the government spend that money, and what could convince them, to spend that money on like building heat adaptation infrastructure? So I just wanted to share this example with you all on how now for the next summer, because this budget is going to go till like April. And so till April, we have 0.5%, of the total budget of Mumbai to spend on heat action plans. And how are we going to spend it, and what are we going to spend it, whether it's just going to be ORS, whether it's just going to be like, fixing ACs of some government building. We don't know. Like there's no accountability on this as to what is supposed to be done and who does that. And just the final closing statement with what Dr. Rao was saying, that we really have high hopes with the medical sector, with the medical stakeholders. Really, like, I don't know, unionizing or finding a way to actually like make this a public health issue or bring awareness on the public health impacts it's going to have and projected to have, because unless it's come from the most credible source, which are the doctors themselves, telling that the public health system really needs to update its heat response mechanisms. We don't think that it's going to make a dent or any difference within our campaigns and our work that we are trying to do in conveying, that this is a very big issue within public health and other sectors to different stakeholders within the government machinery. And the reason I'm saying government is because this is an issue at scale. This is not something that the civil society can fix, how much ever aspirational it looks. This is not something only unions and sectors can fix. This is something the government, with the finances, with the resources and the infrastructure it has, can do. It unfortunately is a top-down approach that we need, because the effects are very, very instant. It's not something that will like take place 5 years from now. It's something that can happen like in October. There could be heat waves in October this year in several parts of the country already experiencing them. Right. So it's again like this is not something that the civil society and unions and communities are responsible to find solutions to, or to take it up on themselves to fix this. They are doing it, unfortunately, because there's a gap, but the accountability has to lie with people in power to spend the right resources on the right things to build adaptation to heat stress.
Apekshita, last words.
I think Sarita spoke really well, and most of the points are covered. I think just to your question of why some of the smaller solutions do not get implemented, and on the parks as well. In fact, the Karnataka High Court has given a judgment about parks being open between the peak heat hours. But again, it's the question of whether or not it's getting implemented. And while we all acknowledge that solving any kind of disaster and something as grave as heat requires a large scale mindset shift in the way we approach urban infrastructure in the first place. We have to rethink the way we're thinking of planning cities. and reduce our reliance on, say, a very like a growth model of development when it comes to cities, to a model which actually works for the people who are living in cities. So while that infrastructure push is essential, I think the other bit that's very, very essential is capacity building among people who are most impacted, so that we're able to raise our voices and make that demand. And eventually, that is what is going to allow implementation to happen. Just as an example, 33 poll workers died because of heat waves in the Indian elections in June. And this is despite multiple guidelines existing from the government of how to approach public safety when it comes to heat waves. So when we encounter a situation like this, where some of the guidelines are in place, when some of the laws are in place, when the judgments are in place, and even then when implementation doesn't happen, then it comes down to, unfortunately, us as people, as informed citizenry, to be able to raise our voice and to take that action, and to be able to demand better working conditions and living conditions for all of us. Because even if we keep the question of caste and class aside, we're all living in Indian cities. We're all experiencing absolutely terrible conditions of life here. So what are we doing about it? How are we trying to tackle those questions? And it's really not something that we can brush under the carpet and say that, okay, somebody else will take care of it. All of us need to rise up. And I think that's eventually going to be the only solution and answer to, but why does this not happen?
Yeah. On that note, I wouldn't take any more of your time and of the listeners' time. Apekshita, Neeti, Sarita, thank you so much for spending the last 90 minutes with us. Um, we are really grateful that you could join us on this Friday evening. We're also very, very grateful to the people listening in who could join us this evening. I wouldn't take any more of your time. I hope all of you have a very good evening and a lovely weekend. And hopefully, we'll see each other soon, very, very soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, Manan, just in case anybody has missed reading on the chat, we will try and get some of the questions that were missed being answered in the live session and share it via email. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.